So now that the United States has more of an international presence, we can focus our attentions outside of our country. Since we had become a country in 1776 and then following, our official independence in the 1780s, we had stayed mostly out of affairs in Europe. If we had been involved in anything, it was more local, more Latin America, those kinds of places. Well, by the late 1800s, Europe is starting to have rumblings of a large war. For centuries, kingdoms and then countries within Europe continually had been vying for land in Europe and elsewhere in their colonies in Africa and Asia. And in 1914, Europe is heavily divided. In the late 1800s and 1870, there had been the Franco-Prussian War, and Germany had invaded France, and they had actually taken French provinces in the east, Alsace and Lorraine. And Germany saw this as the first step in unifying a German country, a German republic. These people were, they believed, German, okay, ethnically German. So after they got this land in 1871, Germany declared itself the German Empire, and it formed an alliance with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. The French, of course, are not happy they lost this land, and so they begin to rebuild their economy to strengthen it, and they start building a military. And they are determined to reclaim Alsace and Lorraine. So the French are now forming alliances with Russia and Great Britain. And the idea of these alliances was that if there was an attack on one country, it could trigger retaliation by others, and then all of Europe would be in a state of war fighting against each other. There's three isms that are very important when we think about how World War I comes to be. The first of those is nationalism, which is a strong belief in one's own country and its superiority to others. And this really conflicts with the individual's ethnic ties to certain regions or with groups of people, because you have groups of people who are ethnically one thing living in different countries. And so this really causes a lot of issues. And I know a lot of times it can seem confusing what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism takes patriotism, that pride and love for your country, and bumps it up to a 10. Like, nobody is better than your country. Another ism, of course, is imperialism. Okay, this drive to conquer and colonize territories, forming empires throughout the world. And Great Britain, France, and Germany had colonies everywhere, and they were competing in those areas. In Africa, for example, a lot of the issues still happening in Africa come about because of this imperialism that's happening here in the late 1800s. The other ism is militarism. And this is a belief that a government must create a strong military and be prepared to use it to achieve the country's goals. So as I've said, most countries have, a large military during wartime, and then when wars are over, they disband the majority of it. Well, Germany and France really start to build their militaries in the late 1800s, and as technology is advancing, this supports that even farther. So by 1914, Germany is a major military power, and France is catching up with them. And Britain has traditionally had a strong navy. Okay, after the Spanish Navy was defeated, Britain kind of was the naval powerhouse around the world. So here's just a map, and you can kind of see here, you have the British are in the light green, so you can see that obviously they have their home islands, but they also have Canada, they have Egypt, Sudan, they have, South Africa and into South Central Africa. They have Australia, India, Burma, okay? And so they're spread out. You have the Russian Empire, which is more strategically located in just Russia, and then, of course, what we know as Eastern Europe. You have France, who has a large portion of territory in North Africa, and then they also have what we call today as Vietnam. And then you see that Germany is in the orange, and they are working on spreading out in Europe as well as other colonies. The Dutch have colonies as well. Belgium has colonies. But you can kind of see how Europe is really divvying up the world at this point. So the spark, okay? All of these things, the militarism, nationalism, imperialism, all of these things they're there. That's the kindling, right? But the spark and the flame happens on June 28th of 1914, okay? And it begins with the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. They're murdered while they're visiting Sarajevo, Bosnia, and they are killed by Serbian nationalists. Serbians who don't want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and want a free and independent Serbia. Well, Austria-Hungary declare war on Serbia. Serbia has an alliance with Russia, so Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany is allied with Austria-Hungary, so they declare war on Russia and France. France is allied with Russia and declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. Britain declares war on Germany, alarmed by its militarism, plus it also has an alliance with France. So you can just see these dominoes falling. So Germany invaded Belgium to reach France's northern border, and they're able to do it quite effectively. And this is really what starts the Great War, the official, what will become known as World War I, because of course at the time we didn't know there'd be a Second World War. So there are two sides. We have the Central Powers and we have the Allied Powers. The Central Powers are Germany and its allies of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, which today is what we consider Turkey and other lands around Turkey, kind of in that Southwest Asia kind of crossover there. The Allied Powers are Great Britain, France, and Russia. And this is in 1914. Notice the United States isn't there. We aren't fighting in 1914. Italy comes in as a neutral power, but it will eventually join the Allies in 1915. And really, America is caught off guard and quite surprised by the sudden outbreak of war in Europe. We had been working on progressivism, and we had been kind of focusing on our own, economic strength and, getting our own imperial, imperial footholdings around the globe. And so they couldn't even believe that a war like this could happen. They thought everybody is trying to better themselves. Why would we go backwards and start a war? Well, the Germans come up with what they call the Schlieffen Plan. And this is a strategy. They're going to quickly go into France, destroy France, and then the German troops could turn east and head towards Russia. And this obviously fails, okay, because the war starts in 1914 and it isn't going to end until 1918. The British support coming in to France stalled the advance of the German army into France, and everybody just kind of gets bogged down. Germany now is fighting on two fronts. It's fighting the Western Front in France and the Eastern Front in Russia. And what happens is as they kind of just get stopped, they start digging trenches, okay? And this trench warfare is used throughout the war. It's a complex network of trenches. They're dug down into the ground. They're lined with boards to ease movement and avoid potential disease from mud and dirty water that's standing in them. And the thing with trenches is, yes, you could take them, but it could cost a lot of lives. And they were very easily taken again. So all of that could be for naught, right? And in between these two trenches, you have the Germans on one side, the French and Allies on the other side. You have this space called no man's land. And it is literally what it sounds like. There is not a living creature in no man's land. The trees are stripped. There are huge holes in the ground from the mortar firing. It is desolate. So what we're looking at here, we have an Allied trench on the left side and a German trench on the right side. So as we look at these, think about what's similar and what's different when we look at these two images. Okay. The Germans were lucky. They had the high ground. Okay. For anyone who knows military strategy, or if you've ever watched Star Wars, the high ground is where you want to be. Okay. The French get the low ground. And so their trenches fill with water, especially during the rainy seasons. It's not at all pleasant. Okay. The Germans are able to have better fortified trenches because they don't get wet. And they are able to maintain them a lot better. So in comes the United States. Okay, what role are we going to play in this skirmish that's happening in Europe? Do we get involved? In 1912, Woodrow Wilson is elected president. He's the first Democrat, serious Democrat, since Lincoln, essentially. There had been one other Democrat in there, but serious Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson declares at the get-go that the U.S. is going to maintain neutrality. Okay, we had been isolationists for years. We didn't believe in getting involved with wars. We believed in kind of staying in the Western Hemisphere. However, we did have economic ties, of course. Okay, so we're walking this fine line with neutrality. Wilson wants to concentrate on our domestic policy and economic reform, and he believes in this idea of moral diplomacy. Okay, reducing intervention in affairs with other countries, lead by example, be an example of democracy. And really, this is a break away from William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy and Teddy Roosevelt's, speak softly and carry a big stick kind of idea. All right. So they tried to lessen the involvement in the Philippines and Latin America at this time, try to kind of reel back this militaristic United States that had kind of come out of the late 1800s. But again, the U.S. is supplying the Allies with weapons and goods to begin the war, and the Central Powers as well, but not nearly to the effect of what we were doing with the Allies. Now, most Americans supported this neutrality, but they were sympathetic to the plight of the countries that were fighting in Europe, because you have to remember, the majority of Americans' ancestors are coming from Europe. So we had 5 million German Americans living in the United States in 1914, and most of those are going to support the Central Powers, the Germans. The U.S. had 3 million Irish Americans who didn't like Great Britain, so they inadvertently support the Central Powers as well. But many Americans have that Western European heritage with Great Britain and France and feel a close relationship with them, because not only maybe do they have that heritage, that hereditary connection, they are also democracies and we have shared histories together. However, one thing for the Allies that people get very concerned about is Russia. It always seems to be Russia. Russia at this time, they are led by a monarch known as a czar, and there had already been upheaval within the country. Even in like 1905, they had kind of a revolt that happened, and they were supposed to be becoming more democratic and weren't. And by this point, communism is starting to kind of pop its head up here and there, and people are looking to overthrow the government in Russia. And so the United States really had quite a deep distrust for Russia. And so many people didn't support the Allied powers because of Russia. Germany also plays an important role in how Americans view this war to begin with. They use a lot of propaganda to sway American opinion. They use newspapers, they use pamphlets. There's a lot of German speaking and German written newspapers and pamphlets in the United States at this point, so it allows them to be able to easily distribute that information. They also used espionage and sabotage to harm the Allied war effort. So we know kind of what that is, right? Espionage is essentially like spying and trying to get secrets and prevent things from happening. Sabotage is literally destroying things. And one of the things that they really focused on was the Americans' efforts of sending goods to Britain and the Allied powers. When it was discovered that Germany was doing these things, that drastically swung the opposition against Germany. In December of 1915, an article in the New York Times reported about another terrible blight on history that was committed by one of the Central Powers, and that was the Armenian genocide. Okay, so Armenia today is a country, and it's in the Caspian Caucasus region of Southwest Asia, kind of by Russia. And what was happening was the Ottoman Empire was forcibly deporting millions of American civilians, and they were being starved and murdered for their ethnicity. And so this becomes one of the first true genocides recorded in history, and it's called the Armenian genocide. And this, again, just further swings public opinion against the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Empire. In 1914, okay, when the war starts, the United States is exporting to Britain and France about $754 million worth of goods every year. In Germany, while less, we're still sending about $190 million at that point. Jump ahead to 2 years later, and we are exporting almost $2.75 billion to France and Britain, and we have practically stopped sending anything to Germany. And the main reason for this is that Britain is running a blockade against supplies going to Germany. So a lot of times we talk about Germany's strategy of using U-boats and, essentially how that's one of the triggers that sends the United States into the war. But we have to understand we're allowing Britain to do that too. And we're just kind of okay with that. And the United States government, banks, and investors are borrowing billions of dollars to the Allies so the Allies can win. So while we're saying that we're trying to stay neutral, we clearly are favoring one side to another, even just by our inaction to prevent Britain from stopping German goods or goods going to Germany.